April 29, 1945. Bavaria. There are smells of wet pine and charred wood. American tanks rumble through the cobblestone streets of a small town whose name will be forgotten by history, but whose image will be burned into the memories of those who witnessed what happened that day. The war is ending. Everyone knows it. The Third Reich, once a colossus that threatened to remake the world in its image, is collapsing inward like a dying star. But in this particular moment, in this particular place, the collapse is made visible not through the thunder of artillery or the screams of the wounded, but through the faces of women in Feldgrau uniforms, standing in a line, their eyes cast downward, their hands trembling. They are Nachricht and Helferin female signal auxiliaries, Blitzmetal. Some call them the Lightning Girls, women who serve the Wehrmacht in communications, administration, and support roles. They are young, most of them, 20, 22, 25 years old. They joined the service believing they were part of something historic, something transcendent. They were told they were the mothers of a new Europe, the guardians of German culture, the shield maidens of a reborn civilization. And now they stand in the mud, surrounded by American soldiers who chew gum and smoke cigarettes, who look at them not with hatred, but with something worse, pity mixed with contempt. An American officer, a captain from Ohio with a face weathered by 3 years of combat, holds a piece of paper in his hand. On it are typed words in German, translated by a Jewish refugee who now wears the uniform of the United States Army. The officer's voice is steady, deliberate. He reads the words aloud, and then he tells the women they must repeat them. They must swear publicly that they renounce National Socialism, that they denounce Adolf Hitler, that they acknowledge the crimes of the regime they served, and they must do this not in private, not in writing, but here, in front of their captors, in front of each other, in front of whatever remains of their dignity. One woman begins to cry. Another stares straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in her neck stand out like cables. A third whispers the words so softly that the captain makes her repeat them, louder, again and again, until her voice cracks and the words tumble out in a broken sob. This is not a battlefield. There are no bullets here, no explosions, but something is being destroyed nonetheless, something invisible, something that had sustained these women through years of rationing and bombing and loss. The myth, the belief that they had been part of something noble, that their sacrifices had meaning, that history would remember them as heroes. Instead, they are being made to confess that they were dupes, accomplices, that the ideology they embraced was a lie wrapped in blood. To understand how these women arrived at this moment, one must go back to the beginning, to the years when National Socialism was not yet synonymous with genocide and world war, but was instead a seductive promise whispered into the ears of a generation traumatized by defeat and humiliation. Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s was a nation adrift. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped it of territory, industry, and pride. Hyperinflation had destroyed the savings of the middle class. Unemployment was rampant. Democracy, imposed by outsiders and associated with weakness, seemed incapable of solving these crises. Into this void came Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party. They offered something that the Weimar Republic could not. Certainty, a clear explanation for Germany's suffering, a vision of national renewal, and crucially for the women who would later serve the regime, a promise of purpose and belonging. The Nazis understood something that their political opponents often missed, that ideology is not just about ideas, but about identity, about who you are and where you fit in the grand sweep of history. For young women growing up in this environment, the Hitler Youth and later the Bund Deutsche and DEL, the League of German Girls, offered an escape from the suffocating confines of traditional domesticity. Yes, Nazi ideology was deeply conservative in its view of gender roles. Women were to be mothers and homemakers, the bearers of erring children, the guardians of the hearth. But it also gave them something that few other institutions did, a sense of mission. They were not just individuals, but part of a collective endeavor to save the nation. They hiked through forests, sang patriotic songs, participated in athletic competitions. They felt strong, capable, essential when war came in 1939. This sense of purpose intensified. Germany was fighting for its survival, or so they were told, and women were needed not just in the home, but in the workforce, in the factories, in the administrative offices that kept the military machine running. As the war expanded and the demands on manpower grew, the Wehrmacht began recruiting women into auxiliary roles. These were not combat positions Nazi ideology forbade women from fighting, but they were vital nonetheless. Women served as radio operators, telephone switchboard technicians, secretaries, translators, nurses. They worked in bunkers deep underground, relaying messages between units, tracking enemy movements, coordinating logistics. The women who joined these services were volunteers. This is important to remember. They were not conscripted, not forced. They chose to serve. Some were motivated by patriotism, others by a desire for adventure or escape from small-town life, still others by genuine ideological conviction. They believed, as millions of Germans did, that they were fighting a defensive war against enemies who sought to destroy their nation. They did not know, most of them, about the death camps, about the Einsatzgruppen, about the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by the regime. Or if they knew fragments, rumors, they pushed them aside, told themselves that such things were exaggerations, enemy propaganda, necessary evils in a struggle for survival. They expected to be heroes, to be celebrated, to be part of a victory that would vindicate all the sacrifices, all the years of hardship. They expected that when the war ended, they would return to a Germany transformed, a utopia where their children would grow up in peace and prosperity, where the Führer's vision had been realized. What they got instead was April 1945. The collapse came faster than anyone anticipated. In January 1945, the Red Army launched its Vistula Oder offensive, smashing through German lines and advancing hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. By February, Soviet forces were on the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. In the west, American and British forces crossed the Rhine in March and began their drive into the heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, grounded by lack of fuel and overwhelmed by Allied air superiority. German cities were being bombed around the clock. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing the advancing Red Army, carrying what little they could salvage from their shattered lives. For the women serving in the auxiliary services, the final months of the war were a descent into chaos. Radio communications became sporadic. Supply lines collapsed. Orders contradicted each other or stopped coming altogether. Some units were told to retreat, others to hold their positions to the last. In the east, women in auxiliary roles faced a terrifying choice: surrender to the Soviets, who were known to treat German women with savage brutality, or flee westward and hope to reach the American or British lines. Those who made it to the west discovered that surrender to the Western Allies was not the relief they had hoped for. Yes, they were not shot out of hand. Yes, they were not subjected to the mass rapes that occurred in Soviet-occupied territories. But they were also not treated with the chivalry or respect that they, in their Nazi-indoctrinated worldview, expected. As German women, as members of the so-called master race, the Americans in particular, had no patience for Nazi ideology. By the time they crossed into Germany, they had seen Buchenwald, they had seen Dachau, they had walked through the camps and seen the piles of emaciated corpses, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the crematoria still warm with the ashes of the murdered. They had liberated survivors who were more skeleton than human, who could barely speak, who flinched at sudden movements because they expected to be beaten or killed. And they had seen in the offices of these camps the meticulous records kept by the SS, documenting every death, every transport, every ounce of gold extracted from the mouths of the dead. The American soldiers who now stood guard over surrendered. German auxiliaries were not interested in hearing excuses. They were not moved by tears or protestations of ignorance. They had been told, in training, that the Germans were a civilized people, a cultured people, the people of Beethoven and Goethe. And yet this civilized people had built factories of death, had industrialized murder, had turned genocide into bureaucracy. And so when these women, these Blitzmittel, these Nachrichtenhelferinnen were captured, the Americans decided that they needed to be re-educated, denazified, that the poison of National Socialist ideology needed to be extracted from their minds, even if the process was humiliating, even if it broke something inside them. The process of denazification began almost immediately after Germany's surrender in May 1945, but its roots can be traced back to the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, when Roosevelt and Churchill declared that they would accept nothing less than the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. This was not just a military strategy, but a political and psychological one. The Allies had learned from the aftermath of World War I, when Germany surrendered before Allied troops set foot on German soil, allowing nationalist demagogues like Hitler to claim that Germany had not truly been defeated, but had been stabbed in the back by traitors at home. This time, there would be no ambiguity. Germany would be occupied. Its leadership would be put on trial. Its people would be made to confront the crimes committed in their name. The Americans approached denazification with the zeal of missionaries. They believed, with an almost naive optimism, that Nazism was a kind of infection that could be cured through exposure to the truth, through education, through the forcible dismantling of the propaganda apparatus that had sustained Hitler's regime. They organized tours of concentration camps for German civilians, forcing them to walk through the barracks, to see the gas chambers, to smell the lingering stench of death. They screened films documenting the atrocities. They plastered posters on walls showing photographs of skeletal prisoners and mass graves, with slogans like "These atrocities, your fault." For the women in the auxiliary services, the denazification process took on a particularly personal and humiliating dimension. Unlike male soldiers, who could be processed en masse and then released or sent to POW camps, these women occupied an ambiguous space in the Allied command structure. They had not borne arms, so they were not technically combatants, but they had worn uniforms, sworn oaths to Hitler, and served the military apparatus of a genocidal regime. What to do with them? The solution, in many cases, was to make them perform their own renunciation, to stand before Allied officers and German civilians and publicly disavow the ideology they had served, to speak the words that shattered the myth of their own innocence. The scene in that Bavarian town in April 1945 was repeated in dozens of locations across occupied Germany. Women were assembled in town squares, in schoolrooms, in military barracks. They were given prepared statements to read, or asked to answer questions about their beliefs, their motivations, their understanding of what the Nazi regime had done. Some refused, and were sent to internment camps. Others complied, but did so mechanically, their faces blank, their voices flat, as if they were speaking words in a foreign language. But for many, the act of renunciation was devastating. Not because they still believed in National Socialism by this point. Most had seen enough to understand that the war was lost and the promises were lies, but because it forced them to confront the complicity that they had spent years denying, even to themselves. They had not pulled the triggers, they had not opened the valves on the gas chambers, but they had enabled those who did. They had transmitted the orders, they had typed the reports, they had kept the machinery of genocide running smoothly. One woman, a former Nachrichtenhelferin named Ilse, later wrote in her diary about the moment she was made to renounce her oath to Hitler. She described feeling as if the ground had opened beneath her, as if she were falling into an abyss. "Everything I believed was a lie," she wrote. "Everything I did was for nothing, worse than nothing. I was a fool, a tool. I helped them kill." What made this process particularly humiliating for these women was not just the act of renunciation itself, but the context in which it occurred. They were surrounded by Americans, men from a country that they had been taught to despise and underestimate. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years portraying America as a decadent, mongrel nation, a hodgepodge of races and cultures held together by nothing but materialism and greed. Americans, they were told, were weak, soft, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice that characterized the German people. They would never be able to match the Wehrmacht in battle, and yet here they were, these Americans, victorious. Their tanks were bigger, their planes faster, their logistics smoother. They had more of everything: food, ammunition, fuel, medicine. Where German soldiers in the final months of the war were half-starved, wearing threadbare uniforms and boots held together with scraps of leather, American GIs looked well-fed and healthy. They handed out chocolate bars and cigarettes as if these were trivial things, as if abundance was the natural state of existence. This abundance was, in itself, a kind of ideological weapon. It undermined one of the core tenets of Nazi ideology, that Germany needed to conquer Lebensraum, living space, in order to survive, because the world's resources were finite and controlled by hostile powers. But here were the Americans, who had no need to conquer anyone, who had so much that they could afford to give it away. The contrast was impossible to ignore for the women being processed through denazification. The presence of American abundance was a constant, nagging reminder of their own deprivation and defeat. They were given rations of white bread, canned meat, powdered milk, foods that they had not seen in years. They watched as American soldiers discarded half-eaten meals, threw away cigarettes after a few puffs, complained about the quality of their coffee. The wastefulness was shocking, almost obscene, but it was also, in a strange way, seductive. It whispered a truth that Nazi ideology had denied, that there was another way to organize a society, a way that did not require total war and total sacrifice, a way that produced plenty rather than scarcity. One of the recurring objects in the accounts of these women is the chocolate bar. American soldiers carried them in their pockets and handed them out to children, to German civilians, to prisoners, to the women in auxiliary roles. The chocolate bar became a symbol of everything they had been denied, everything they had sacrificed for a cause that had betrayed them. It was sweet, rich, indulgent. It represented a world where people could afford to care about pleasure, about comfort, about the small joys of life. A world that Nazi Germany, with its relentless focus on struggle and sacrifice, had rejected. Some women refused the chocolate at first. It felt like a betrayal, like admitting defeat, not just militarily but morally. But hunger has a way of eroding principles, and so they ate, and the sweetness on their tongues was bitter. The humiliation of denazification was compounded by the presence of Jewish survivors and refugees among the Allied forces. Many of the translators, interrogators, and administrators working for the American military government were Jews who had fled Germany in the 1930s, or who had survived the camps, or who had fought their way back to Europe as soldiers in the American or British armies. For these individuals, the opportunity to confront their former oppressors was fraught with complex emotions: rage, grief, a desire for justice, and sometimes a grim satisfaction. One such translator was a woman named Rachel Newman, who had escaped Berlin in 1938 with her family and eventually made her way to New York. She joined the Women's Army Corps and returned to Europe as part of the occupation force. In her memoirs, she describes being assigned to interview a group of Nachrichtenhelferinnen who had been captured near Munich. She recognized one of them, a woman named Greta, who had been in her class in school, who had once been her friend. I asked her if she remembered me. Rachel wrote, "She looked at me for a long time, and then she looked away. She said nothing. I asked her if she knew what had happened to the Jews of Berlin. Still nothing. I told her that my grandmother had been sent to the Seienstadt and then to Auschwitz, and that she had been murdered there. I told her that my uncle had been beaten to death on Kristallnacht. I told her that my best friend, who used to come to our house for Shabbat dinner, had disappeared in 1943, and I never found out what happened to her." And Greta just stood there, tears running down her face, saying, I didn't know, but she did know. Maybe not the details, but she knew enough. She knew that we were no longer welcome. She knew that we were taken away. She knew, and she did nothing. This confrontation, repeated in countless variations across occupied Germany, was central to the denazification process. The point was not just to extract confessions or to punish, but to force a reckoning. To make these women, these ordinary people who had convinced themselves that they were innocent bystanders, understand that there were no innocent bystanders, that their silence had been complicity, that their service had enabled atrocity. For some, this reckoning led to genuine transformation. They spent the rest of their lives working to atone, educating others about the dangers of fascism, speaking out against totalitarianism. For others, it led to a hardening, a retreat into denial and resentment. They convinced themselves that they were the true victims, that the Allies were hypocrites, that the atrocities had been exaggerated or invented. But for many, perhaps most, the truth was somewhere in between. They were neither heroes nor monsters, but something more human and more troubling. People who had made choices, small and large, that added up to something monstrous. People who had believed lies because the lies were comforting, because the lies gave them purpose and belonging. People who had looked away because looking directly would have required them to act, and acting would have been dangerous. The public renunciations of National Socialism were not the end of the denazification process, but the beginning. The Allied occupation authorities implemented a massive bureaucratic system to categorize every adult German based on their level of involvement with the Nazi regime. There were 5 categories: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. Everyone had to fill out a Fragebogen, a questionnaire with over 100 questions about their political activities, party membership, employment history, and beliefs. For the women of the auxiliary services, This process was often deeply frustrating. They had not been members of the SS. They had not participated in massacres or deportations. They had, in their own minds, simply done their jobs, answered telephones, transmitted messages. Why were they being treated like criminals? The answer, which many of them struggled to accept, was that the Allied authorities understood something that these women did not, or would not, that totalitarian regimes do not function through a small cadre of fanatics, but through the complicity of millions of ordinary people who convince themselves that they are just following orders, just doing their jobs, just trying to survive. The banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt would later call it, the Freitbogen was designed to make this complicity visible. It asked not just about formal party membership, but about every point of contact with the Nazi system. Did you attend rallies? Did you contribute to party funds? Did you inform on your neighbors? Did you benefit from Aryanized property? Did you, in 1,000 small ways, participate in and enable the machinery of oppression? Many women lied on their questionnaires. They omitted memberships, downplayed their roles, claimed ignorance. But the Allied investigators were thorough. They cross-referenced documents, interviewed witnesses, dug through Nazi records that had survived the war, and when they caught someone in a lie, the consequences were severe. Lying on a Freitbogen could result in imprisonment, loss of employment, or classification as an offender rather than a follower. The entire process was, by design, humiliating. It forced people to account for every aspect of their lives during the Nazi years, to justify choices that had once seemed natural or necessary, to confront the gap between the heroic self-image that propaganda had cultivated and the sordid reality of what they had actually done. For the women who had served in the auxiliary services, this was compounded by a gendered dimension of shame. In German society, women were supposed to be the moral guardians, the bearers of culture and tradition, the civilizing influence on male aggression. The fact that women had served the Nazi regime had enabled its crimes, challenged this comforting fiction. It suggested that women were no more immune to the seductions of fascism than men, that they were equally capable of cruelty and complicity. This realization was, for many, more devastating than the military defeat itself. It meant that they could not retreat into the role of innocent victims, could not claim that they had been powerless or ignorant. They had made choices. They bore responsibility. In the months and years after the war, Germany became a landscape of ruins, both physical and psychological. The cities were heaps of rubble. The economy had collapsed. Millions of people were displaced, homeless, starving. But perhaps the deepest ruin was the collapse of meaning, the destruction of the myths and narratives that had given people's lives coherence and purpose. For the women who had served the Nazi regime, this collapse of meaning was particularly acute. They had invested years of their lives in a cause that had been revealed as not just false, but evil. They had sacrificed, suffered, believed, and it had all been for nothing. Worse than nothing, some of them could not bear it. Suicide rates among former Nazi officials and supporters spiked in the months after the surrender. Others retreated into denial, convincing themselves that the atrocities were Allied propaganda, that Germany had been the true victim, that Hitler had been right about everything except strategy. That many others embarked on a long, painful process of coming to terms with what they had done and what they had enabled. They read the reports from the Nuremberg trials, where the evidence of Nazi crimes was laid out in excruciating detail. They visited the sites of the camps, now preserved as memorials. They listened to the testimony of survivors, and slowly, reluctantly, they began to accept the truth. This process of acceptance was not linear or complete. People cycled through denial, anger, bargaining, depression. They made excuses, pointed fingers, minimized their own roles. But over time, for some at least, a kind of reckoning emerged. A recognition that they had been wrong, that they had been complicit, that they bore a share of the guilt. One woman, a former Blitz medal named Hannibal, later became a schoolteacher in post-war West Germany. She made it her mission to educate her students about the Nazi era, not as history to be memorized, but as a moral lesson to be internalized. In a letter she wrote in the 1960s, she reflected on her experience of denazification. At the time, I thought the Americans were being cruel, making us stand there and renounce our oaths, making us look at photographs of the camps, forcing us to confront things we did not want to see. I hated them for it. I felt humiliated, degraded, treated like a criminal when I had never hurt anyone. But now, decades later, I understand that they were not being cruel. They were being necessary. Because if they had not forced us to look, we would have looked away. We would have told ourselves comforting lies, would have convinced ourselves that we were innocent, and Germany would have never truly confronted what it had done. The humiliation I felt was nothing compared to the humiliation of those who suffered under the regime I served. The least I could do was stand there and speak the truth. The symbolic object that recurs in the accounts of these women, threading through their memories like a dark ribbon, is the oath. Every woman who served in the auxiliary forces had sworn an oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. The wording varied, slightly depending on the branch of service and the year, but the core was always the same. I swear by God this sacred oath, that I will render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the FHR of the German Reich and people, and that I will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath. The oath was not a mere formality. In German military culture, the oath was sacred, binding, absolute. To break an oath was to dishonor oneself, to violate the deepest principles of duty and loyalty. This was drilled into recruits from day one. The oath was what separated soldiers from civilians, what transformed individuals into instruments of the state's will. For the women who swore this oath, it was a moment of pride and solemnity. They were joining something larger than themselves, pledging their lives to a cause that they believed was just and necessary. The oath was their identity, their purpose, their connection to history. And then, in the spring of 1945, they were made to break it, to stand before allied officers and renounce the very oath that had defined them, to declare that the FHR, to whom they had pledged unconditional obedience, was a criminal, a monster, a destroyer of nations. To say, out loud, that their oath had been a lie. This was not just a political renunciation. It was a spiritual and psychological dismemberment. The oath had been the anchor of their identity, and now it was gone, replaced by a void that nothing could fill. Some women tried to cling to the letter of the oath even as they renounced its spirit. I swore to obey until death, one woman told an American interrogator. I kept my oath. I obeyed. If the FHR ordered crimes, that is his sin. Not mine, but the interrogator, a Jewish refugee from Frankfurt who had lost his entire family in the Holocaust, was unmoved. You swore an oath to a mass murderer, he replied. Your obedience made you complicit in his crimes. Your oath binds you to nothing but guilt. The breaking of the oath was designed to be traumatic, because the Allies understood that without such trauma, many Germans would never truly confront their complicity. They would rationalize, compartmentalize, convince themselves that they had just been following orders, that they were not responsible. The public renunciation, the forced breaking of the sacred oath, was meant to shatter that defense, to make denial impossible. It worked, to a degree. The humiliation of standing in a town square and renouncing the oath, of speaking words that violated everything they had been taught about duty and loyalty, left scars that lasted a lifetime. But scars can be a form of memory, a permanent reminder of a wound that must not be forgotten. The transformation that these women underwent was not immediate, and it was not universal, but it was real. The experience of denazification, of being forced to confront their complicity, changed many of them in fundamental ways. They could no longer see the world through the simplistic lens of Nazi ideology, which divided humanity into races and nations locked in eternal struggle. They could no longer believe in the myth of German superiority, the fantasy of the 1,000-year Reich. The world was more complex, more ambiguous, more tragic than they had been taught. Some of these women became active participants in the democratic rebuilding of Germany. They joined political parties, worked for reconciliation with former enemies, supported the integration of refugees and displaced persons. They recognized that the Germany they had served had been a perversion, a nightmare, and that building a new Germany required rejecting everything the old regime had stood for. Others remained silent, carrying their guilt and shame in private. They never spoke about their wartime service, never told their children or grandchildren what they had done. The past was a locked room in their minds, a place they could not bear to enter, but even those who remained silent were changed. They raised their children differently, emphasizing tolerance and critical thinking rather than obedience and conformity. They recoiled from authoritarianism, from grandiose promises and charismatic leaders. They had learned, at terrible cost, that ideology is dangerous, that certainty is a trap. that the most monstrous crimes are often committed by people who believe they are serving a higher good. The evidence of this transformation can be seen in the post-war trajectory of West Germany. Within a generation, the country that had produced the Holocaust became a liberal democracy, a champion of human rights, a leader in the process of European integration. This was not inevitable. It required conscious effort, sustained commitment, and a willingness to confront the past rather than bury it. The women who had been humiliated by the denazification process played a small but significant role in this transformation. They were living reminders of the dangers of fanaticism, of the ease with which ordinary people can be drawn into complicity with evil. Their presence in post-war German society, their gradual acceptance of responsibility, contributed to a culture of reflection and accountability that might not have emerged if they had simply been ignored or dismissed. The epilogue to this story unfolds over decades. In 1985, 40 years after the end of the war, a ceremony was held in the ruins of Bergen-Belsen, one of the concentration camps liberated by the British in April 1945. Among those in attendance were survivors of the camp, British veterans who had been present at the liberation, and a delegation of German citizens, including several women who had served in their auxiliary forces during the war. One of these women, now in her 60s, was asked to speak. She stood before the assembled crowd, her voice shaking but clear, and she spoke about her experience of denazification. She spoke about standing in a town square in Bavaria, surrounded by American soldiers, and being made to renounce her oath to Hitler. She spoke about how humiliated she had felt, how angry, how lost. And then she spoke about the journey that followed, the slow, painful process of understanding what the regime she had served had done, the guilt that she carried, the responsibility she could never escape. I thought, at the time, that the Americans were trying to destroy me, she said. But now I understand that they were trying to save me, to save all of us, because without that confrontation, without being forced to speak the truth out loud, I would have spent the rest of my life living a lie. I would have told myself that I was innocent, that I had done nothing wrong, that the crimes of the regime were not my responsibility. But I was not innocent. I served that regime. I enabled its crimes, and the only way I could begin to atone was to admit that truth, to carry that guilt, to ensure that future generations would never make the same mistakes. She paused, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees that had grown up around the camp's perimeter. The humiliation I felt was nothing, she continued, compared to the suffering of those who died here. Nothing, but it was the beginning of my journey back to humanity, and for that, I am grateful. The story of these women, of their humiliation and transformation, is not a simple morality tale. It does not offer easy lessons or comforting conclusions. It is a story about the fragility of civilization, about how quickly people can be seduced by ideology, about the long and difficult path back from complicity to accountability. It is also a story about the power of truth. The Americans who forced these women to renounce their oaths understood something essential, that lies, even comforting lies, even lies that allow people to preserve their dignity, are corrosive. They eat away at the possibility of genuine reconciliation and renewal. Only by confronting the truth, no matter how painful, can societies move forward. The chocolate bars that American soldiers handed out, the abundance that seemed so wasteful and decadent to eyes trained by Nazi propaganda, were more than just food. They were symbols of a different way of organizing society, a way that did not require total war and total sacrifice, a way that believed in the possibility of prosperity for all rather than survival of the strongest. The humiliation of standing in a town square and renouncing the FHR was the price of entry into that world, a world that the women who served the Nazi regime had been taught to despise, but which offered something they had been denied for so long, the possibility of a future not defined by struggle and death. The oath they broke was the oath that had bound them to a genocidal regime, the oath they implicitly swore in its place, though it was never formally articulated, was an oath to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that such a regime could never rise again. It was an oath to democracy, to human rights, to the idea that individuals have worth and dignity independent of race or nation or ideology. This new oath was not sacred in the way the old one had been. It did not promise glory or transcendence. It promised only the hard work of building a decent society, one choice at a time, one day at a time. It promised humility instead of pride, doubt instead of certainty, responsibility instead of obedience. And for those women who truly took it to heart, who spent the rest of their lives trying to atone for their complicity, it was enough. Not to erase the past that could never be done, not to achieve redemption that was not theirs to claim, but to ensure that the suffering of the victims was not forgotten, that the lessons of the catastrophe were passed on to future generations, that the seductive promises of fascism would be met with skepticism and resistance. In the end, the humiliation of those female officers in the spring of 1945 was a necessary violence, a breaking that allowed for the possibility of healing. It was the moment when the myth shattered, when the comfortable lies could no longer be sustained, when the full weight of complicity became inescapable. It was not pleasant, it was not dignified, but it was essential, because the alternative was to allow them to go on believing the lie, to let them convince themselves that they were innocent, that they had been victims of circumstance, that history would vindicate them. And if that had happened, if Germany had not been forced to confront its crimes, if the perpetrators and enablers had been allowed to retreat into denial, then the millions who died in the camps and on the battlefields would have died for nothing. Their deaths would have been erased, forgotten, rendered meaningless. The women who stood in that Bavarian town square, who spoke the words of renunciation through tears and clenched teeth, became living monuments to a terrible truth, that ordinary people, good people, people who love their families and care about their communities, are capable of enabling monstrous evil if they believe the right lies, if they pledge their loyalty to the wrong cause, if they value obedience over conscience. The oath they broke was not just an oath to Hitler. It was an oath to the seductive fantasy that there is a shortcut to national greatness, that prosperity can be achieved through conquest, that a nation can be reborn by purging itself of the undesirable. It was an oath to the idea that ideology is more important than humanity, that the collective is more sacred than the individual, that the end justifies any means. Breaking that oath, speaking those words of renunciation, was the first step on a long road back to sanity. It did not absolve them of guilt. It did not undo the harm, but it acknowledged the harm, named it, refused to hide it behind euphemisms or excuses. And in a world that had been consumed by lies, that acknowledgement of truth was a small but essential act of redemption. The abundance of the Americans, the chocolate and the white bread and the cigarettes, was not just material wealth. It was the abundance of a society that believed in the possibility of peaceful prosperity, that did not require its citizens to sacrifice everything on the altar of national greatness. It was the abundance of freedom, the freedom to question authority, to criticize leaders, to choose one's own path. The women who tasted their chocolate, who spoke those words of renunciation, were tasting and speaking the truth of that abundance. And though it was bitter at first, mixed with the ashes of their shattered dreams, it was also sweet with the promise of a different kind of future, not a future of glory and conquest, not a future where they would be celebrated as heroes, but a future where they could live as human beings, flawed and guilty, but also capable of growth, of change, of choosing a better path. That, in the end, is the legacy of those humiliating moments in the spring of 1945. Not vengeance, but transformation. Not punishment for its own sake, but the painful birth of a new understanding. The understanding that freedom requires responsibility, that democracy demands vigilance, that civilization is fragile and must be defended not with guns and oaths, but with truth and accountability and the courage to confront our own complicity when we have gone astray. The women who were humiliated learned this lesson the hard way. They paid a price for their complicity, a price measured not in years of imprisonment or material loss, but in the shattering of their identity, the destruction of their self-image, the burden of guilt that they would carry for the rest of their lives. But in paying that price, they became teachers. Their lives, their testimony, their willingness to speak truth about their own failures, became a warning and a guide for future generations, a reminder that the greatest threats to humanity come not from monsters, but from ordinary people who convince themselves that they are serving a noble cause, who pledge their loyalty to leaders who promise easy answers to complex problems, who value belonging and purpose more than truth and justice. The chocolate bar, that small symbol of American abundance, melts on the tongue and is gone. But the lesson remains. Freedom is not just the absence of tyranny. It is the presence of accountability, the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, The courage to break sacred oaths when those oaths bind us to evil. And that lesson, learned in humiliation and shame by women who stood in town squares and renounced the FHR they had served, is perhaps the most important legacy of the denazification process. Not that it was perfectly executed, it was not. Not that it fully achieved its goals, it did not. But that it insisted on truth, on accountability, on the necessity of confrontation rather than evasion. In the ruins of the Third Reich in the spring of 1945, the myth died, and in its place, slowly, painfully, a new possibility was born. The possibility of a Germany that would remember rather than forget, that would acknowledge rather than deny, that would choose democracy over dictatorship, freedom over fascism, truth over myth. The women who were humiliated became, despite themselves, midwives to that new possibility. Their tears watered the seeds of a different future. Their broken oaths became the foundation of a more honest reckoning with the past. Their shame became, in time, a source of wisdom, and the chocolate, sweet and rich, symbol of abundance and freedom, dissolves on the tongue, leaving behind only the memory of its taste. But memories, as those women learned, are sometimes more powerful than myths, because myths offer escape from reality, while memories demand that we face it. In the facing of that reality, in the breaking of that oath, in the speaking of those words of renunciation, something essential was preserved. Not innocence that was long gone, but the possibility of wisdom, the chance to learn from catastrophe, the hope that the next generation would choose differently. That hope, fragile and uncertain as it was in the spring of 1945, was the true gift of denazification. Not freedom handed down from on high, but freedom earned through the painful work of confronting complicity, of breaking false idols, of speaking truth even when it shatters the comfortable stories we tell ourselves. The women who stood in that town square, who spoke those words through tears and shame, did not know then that they were participating in something historic. They felt only humiliation, defeat, the collapse of everything they had believed. But in that collapse, in that humiliation, was the seed of something new, something that would grow slowly into a society that valued truth more than myth, accountability more than obedience, freedom more than glory. And that, in the end, is why their story matters. Not because they were heroes, they were not. Not because they were victims, they were not that either. But because they were human beings who made terrible choices, who enabled terrible crimes, and who were forced to confront what they had done. And in that confrontation, in that humiliating, necessary breaking of the oath, they became something more than they had been before. They became witnesses, cautionary tales, living reminders of how easily good intentions can be twisted to serve evil ends, and how much courage it takes to admit that we were wrong, that we were complicit, that we bear responsibility. The chocolate melts, the oath breaks, the truth emerges, and in the ruins of a shattered Reich, a new story begins.